Silas Crowell didn't knock. He never knocked. He pushed open the door of the Red Willow Land office like he owned it, because in every way that mattered in 1878 Montana Territory, he did. He dropped a leather satchel on the counter, slid 3 folded documents across the wood, and looked at the clerk the way a man looks at something stuck to the bottom of his boot. "Stamp those," he said. The clerk, a thin young man named Petey Graves, unfolded the first page. His hands went still. "Mr. Crowell, these survey markers, they don't match the Henderson's original filing. The creek boundary here shows—" Crowell reached across the counter and pressed one thick finger down on the page. "Stamp them." Petey's face went white. He stamped all 3. By noon, the Henderson family's water access no longer existed on paper. By nightfall, 2 other homestead families downstream would find their wells running dry, and Silas Crowell would be eating a warm supper, completely unbothered. But he didn't know yet about the woman who'd just arrived in Red Willow, and he didn't know that she'd seen this exact trick before. If stories like this one speak to something you carry inside you, subscribe to this channel and follow every part to the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me your city or your country. I want to see how far this story travels. Don't miss what comes next, because this one is only getting started. The wagon that brought Maribel Shaw into Red Willow belonged to a grain merchant named Pudge Calloway, who talked constantly and expected nothing back. That suited Maribel fine. She'd spent the last 3 weeks riding across open country with her 2 canvas bags, 1 cast-iron skillet, and a small crate of preserving jars she refused to leave behind, no matter how much weight she had to haul. The jars clinked together over every rut in the road, and Pudge had asked twice if she wanted to leave them in the back under the grain sacks. "I'll keep them where I can see them," she said both times. He didn't ask a third time. Maribel was 31 years old, and she looked like a woman who had worked hard since before she should have had to. She was large, full-figured in the way that frontier life couldn't hollow out no matter how lean the winters got, with wide hips and heavy arms and a round face that carried its softness the way a river stone carries its smoothness, earned over time, not given. Her hair was thick chestnut, usually pinned back with whatever she had available, and her eyes were a color most people couldn't quite name, somewhere between gray and green depending on the light and depending on her mood. When she was thinking, they went almost silver. When she was angry, they went dark. She was thinking now, watching Red Willow come into view through the wagon's front canvas gap. It was a town like 20 other towns she'd passed through. A main street with a general store, a livery, 2 saloons, a church with a crooked bell tower, and a land office with fresh paint on the sign that didn't match the weathered boards underneath. The kind of fresh paint that meant someone wanted the office to look like it had just opened, even when it had been doing business for years. Maribel's eyes stayed on that land office for a moment longer than everything else. Then Pudge pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the general store and said, "End of the line, Miss Shaw. Good luck finding work." "I'll find it," she said, and climbed down before he could offer to help. She stood in the street with her 2 bags and her crate and looked at the town the way a woman looks at a problem she intends to solve. There were perhaps 300 people in Red Willow, maybe 400 if you counted the outlying ranch families who came in for supplies. The mercantile would have a notice board. That was always where the work was posted. She found the board around the side of the building, tacked up between a flyer for a missing mare and an advertisement for patent medicine that promised to cure 17 separate ailments. Most of the notices were old. A family needed help with washing, posted 6 weeks ago. A school teacher position that had probably been filled by now. A carpenter wanted, also old. And then, at the bottom, pinned with 2 nails like whoever wrote it had been in a hurry, cook and housekeeper needed, 1 night only. Important supper, pay, $4. Inquire at the Vale Ranch, 3 miles north on the Creek Road. Today only. $4 for 1 night was unusual. Unusual enough to mean either the job was genuinely difficult or the man posting it was genuinely desperate. Maribel had learned that both things usually meant the same thing. She tore the notice off the board and put it in her coat pocket. She found a boy near the livery and paid him 2 cents to watch her bags, and then she rented a horse for the afternoon. An old bay mare named something the stable hand couldn't remember, and rode 3 miles north on the Creek Road to see what kind of man posted a notice like that. She smelled the ranch before she saw it. Cattle, hay. Horse sweat and leather and the particular dusty smell of land that had been worked seriously for a long time. And underneath all of it, something else. Wood smoke, but thin, like a fire that hadn't been properly tended in days. Then the mansion came into view, and Maribel pulled the mare to a slow walk. She had expected a ranch house. This was not a ranch house. It was enormous, 2 full stories of timber and stone with a wide front porch that ran the length of the building, 4 chimneys, and windows that caught the afternoon light like the place was trying to show off. Whoever built it had spent serious money and serious time. The structure itself was sound, the craftsmanship was good, but the porch railing had a broken section that hadn't been repaired. The flower beds on either side of the front steps were full of dead growth that hadn't been cleared since the previous fall. 2 of the upper windows had shutters that hung at wrong angles. There were wood shavings swept into a pile near the left corner that no one had bothered to remove. The house looked like a man had built it, and then immediately forgotten how to take care of it. Maribel tied the mare to the fence post and walked to the front door and knocked. Nothing happened for a full 30 seconds. Then there was the sound of boots on hardwood, and the door opened, and Ronan Vale looked down at her. He was taller than she expected, broad through the shoulders in a way that said physical work, not just authority, though he clearly had both. Dark hair going slightly gray at the temples, a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in at least 4 days, and the kind of eyes that had spent years looking at far distances. Dark brown, direct, and currently running a fast assessment of the woman standing on his front step. Maribel could see the exact moment he registered her size. She had watched that moment happen 10,000 times. The slight shift in the eyes, the quick recalibration, the decision about what kind of person she was and what she was capable of, made in less than 2 seconds and based on nothing except what she looked like. She met his eyes and waited. Ronan Vale said, "You're here about the notice." "I am." "You're a cook?" "I am. And a housekeeper, and a livestock hand, and a fair hand at carpentry if the job requires it. But you posted for a cook." He looked at her for another moment. Then he said, "The supper's for 8 men, 6 ranchers and 2 men from the Territorial Land Office. I need the house presentable and a proper meal on the table by 7 o'clock tonight. I haven't had regular house staff for 8 months. 8 months, Maribel repeated. Is that a problem? Depends on what the inside looks like. He hesitated. Then he stepped back and let her in. The inside was worse than the outside. Not filthy. Ronan Vale was clearly not a man who lived in filth, but empty in a way that went beyond furniture. The entry hall was clean enough but bare, with no rugs on the stone floor and no pictures on the walls, and a coat rack that held 2 jackets and a single hat, all of which belonged to a man who lived alone and wanted anyone looking to know it. The front room had good furniture, expensive furniture, but arranged the way furniture gets arranged when no one has moved it in years. Everything was pushed to the walls. The center of the room was empty space. The kitchen was in the back of the house, and it was large, and it had good equipment, a wide iron stove, good pots, a proper larder door, and someone had stocked it recently, in a hurry, because there were sacks of flour and dried beans and 2 sides of salted pork, stacked in no particular order on the shelves, alongside several tins of things that hadn't been opened, and a basket of root vegetables that had been sitting long enough to start softening. Maribel stood in the kitchen and turned around slowly, looking at everything. Ronan stood in the doorway and watched her look. "Well?" he said. She said, "You've spent a fortune building this place, Mr. Vale, but money can't make a house warm." He didn't say anything to that. She took off her coat and hung it on the peg by the kitchen door. "I'll need help from one of your ranch hands for the heavy lifting. I need the front room furniture moved into a proper arrangement. I need wood brought in for all 4 fireplaces, and I need them lit within the hour. I need water heated, and I need you to stay out of my kitchen until I call you." A muscle moved in his jaw. He was not a man accustomed to being given instructions in his own house. "You haven't agreed to the job yet," he said. "Yes, I have," Maribel said, and turned to the stove to begin. She heard him exhale behind her. Then she heard his boots on the stone floor as he went to find her a ranch hand. His name was Cully Marsh, and he was 23 years old and good-natured about being told what to do by a woman he'd never met, which immediately put him in Maribel's good graces. He moved furniture when she pointed, carried firewood when she asked, and only once tried to tell her that Mr. Vale didn't usually allow open fires in the front parlor. "He's allowing it tonight," Maribel said. "Yes, ma'am," Cully said, and lit the fire. The afternoon went by the way all real work goes by. Too fast and too slow at the same time, full of small problems that required solutions and larger problems that required improvisation. The salted pork needed longer than she'd hoped. The onions in the root vegetable basket were soft, but not gone, salvageable if she worked them properly. There was no cream in the larder, but there was canned milk, which was not the same thing and was not going to pretend to be. She made biscuits from memory. She always made biscuits from memory. The recipe had come from her mother and her mother's mother before that, and it was not written anywhere because it didn't need to be. Around 4 o'clock, Cully appeared at the kitchen door. "Ma'am, Mr. Vale wants to know how it's going." "Tell Mr. Vale it's going the way it goes when someone knows what they're doing," Maribel said without looking up from the stove. "And ask him if any of his guests have particular aversions to pepper. Some men from territorial offices are delicate." Cully disappeared. He came back 5 minutes later. "Mr. Vale says to use as much pepper as you want and damn the territorial men." Maribel almost smiled. "Good answer," she said. By 6:30, the front room had been transformed. The furniture was arranged around the two fireplaces in a way that invited people to actually sit in it. Cully had found a braided rug in one of the back rooms that turned out to be in perfectly good condition. It had just been rolled up and put away. The dining table had been extended with its leaves, which Maribel had found in a closet off the kitchen. She'd pressed a linen tablecloth she found in the same closet, slightly yellowed at the folds but passable, and set the table with the good china that had been sitting in a cabinet for long enough that every piece needed washing before use. She washed every piece. The food was ready at 5 to 7, pork roast with an onion gravy, roasted root vegetables, fresh biscuits, a pot of beans cooked down with salt pork and herbs she'd found dried and hanging in a bunch near the larder door. Someone had put them there a long time ago, and they were still good. There was no dessert because there wasn't time, but she'd found a jar of preserved pears in the very back of the larder shelf, and she put them out with some hard cheese, and that was dessert enough. At exactly 7 o'clock, wheels sounded in the drive. Ronan appeared in the kitchen doorway. He had changed. Clean shirt, clean jacket, his hair combed back. He looked like a man who cleaned up when it was required of him and genuinely didn't care about it otherwise, which Maribel thought was probably accurate. He was looking at the kitchen, at the stove and the counter and the organized pots and the biscuits cooling on the rack and the smell that had settled into the room over the past 2 hours like a thing with weight. "The front room," he started. "Is ready." "Ready," Maribel said. "Go receive your guests." He stayed in the doorway for another second. Then he said, "You do good work." "I know," Maribel said. His mouth moved, something that was almost a smile. Then he was gone. The supper went for 2.5 hours. Maribel served from the kitchen and listened to the sounds coming from the dining room the way she always listened. Not to the words, but to the rhythm. Early in the meal, the talk was formal, the laughter too polished, the way men talk when they are performing for each other. But somewhere around the second time she brought biscuits, the formality cracked open. The voices dropped into something more natural. Someone laughed at something genuinely funny. Someone else disagreed about something and said so directly, without the careful cushion of polite language. The food was doing what good food always did. When the meal was over and the men had gone into the front room with their whiskey, Cully helped Maribel clear the table and she began washing up. Her feet hurt. Her back had been aching since around 5 o'clock. She said nothing about either. Cully said quietly, while drying a plate, "Haven't heard this place sound like that in a long time." "Like what?" Maribel asked. He thought about it. "Like a house with people in it." She didn't say anything back. She just washed the next plate. The guests left around 10. She heard their wagons rolling out. She heard the front door close. She was finishing the last of the pots when Ronan appeared in the kitchen again. He stood there for a moment, looking at the room. Everything was clean and put away. "One of the men," he said, "Hector Bowes, asked me who my housekeeper was." Maribel set the last pot on its hook. "What did you tell him?" "I told him she was temporary." He paused. "He told me I was a fool." "He sounds like a man with sense," Maribel said. She dried her hands and reached for her coat. Ronan said, "Stay until winter." She turned and looked at him. He was leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed, and he looked like a man who was not accustomed to asking for things, and was therefore not very good at it. His jaw was set in the way it got when something mattered, and he didn't want to show how much. You said one night, Maribel said. I know what I said. What would I be doing until winter? What you did today, running the house, making sure it functions. I'll pay you properly. He named a number that was more than she had made in any 2-month stretch in the last 4 years. You'd have your own room in the East Wing. No one bothers you. No one tells you how to do your work. She looked at him carefully. He held the look without flinching. And what do you want in return? She asked. Beyond the cooking. Something shifted in his face. Not offense, closer to recognition, like he'd expected the question and knew it was fair. The same thing I had tonight, he said. A house that functions. Food that's real. I don't know how to do what you just did. He said it flatly, without embarrassment, which meant he'd made his peace with it. I know how to run 40 men and 5,000 acres and a cattle operation that turns a profit in bad years. I don't know how to make a house worth coming home to. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the wind had come up and was pushing against the walls in the comfortable way that wind pushes against a well-built structure. Maribel looked at the kitchen, at the pots on their hooks and the biscuit rack and the stove that she had coaxed from barely adequate to genuinely useful in one afternoon. She thought about the road west. She thought about California, which was still a vague shape in her mind rather than a real plan, a direction rather than a destination. She thought about 8 months of no house staff and a man who came home to empty rooms. She said, I have a condition. Name it. I am not your possession, Mr. Vale. I'm not your decoration, your symbol, or your charity case. I work for you, and I do that work the way I know it should be done, and you do not interfere and you do not condescend, and if you ever introduce me to anyone as just the help, I'll pack my bags before they finish shaking your hand. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Agreed. And I need 1 day a week that is mine completely, to do as I see fit. Agreed. And if I see something that needs doing on this ranch, not just in the house, I say so and you listen, even if you don't like it. A long pause. Longer than the others. This was the one that cost him something. Agreed, he said. Maribel put her coat back on the peg. I'll stay until winter, she said. Then we'll see. She did not go back to her bags that night. Cully, who seemed to have appointed himself the unofficial welcomer of people who needed welcoming, showed her to the East Wing room, which had a proper bed and a window that looked out toward the pasture and a water pitcher on the stand that he filled fresh without being asked. She lay in the dark for a while, listening to the new sounds. The particular creak of this roof, the way the wind moved around the east corner differently than she expected, the distant sound of cattle shifting in the night. It was a good house, solid, built by someone who took construction seriously. It just had no idea what it was supposed to be. She fell asleep thinking about the pantry and everything that needed to be done to it before the week was out. She didn't know yet about Silas Crowell. She didn't know about the altered survey markers, or the diverted water, or the 3 homestead families slowly losing everything to a man with a leather satchel and a compliant clerk. She didn't know that the thing that had happened to her father's farm in Nebraska, the thing she had run from for 6 years, working from ranch to ranch, never staying long enough to lose anything again, was happening right now, 3 miles downstream, to people who had no idea what to do about it. She didn't know any of it yet, but she would. And when Silas Crowell eventually found out that Ronan Vale had a woman on his ranch who'd seen this exact scheme before and knew every thread of it, who had spent 6 years quietly learning what she'd needed to know, carrying that knowledge the way she carried her preserving jars, carefully and close, he would reach for his leather satchel, and he would find that it wasn't going to be enough. But that was still ahead. For now, Maribel Shaw was asleep in a room that felt, for the first time in longer than she could honestly remember, like it might still be there in the morning. And that, for now, was enough. The next day, she started on the pantry. It took her most of the morning to pull everything out, assess what was salvageable, organize what remained, and write a list of what needed to be purchased in town. The list was long. Ronan, who appeared in the kitchen doorway around mid-morning with a cup of coffee, looked at the list when she held it out and said, "Is all of this necessary?" "That's a serious question?" Maribel said. He studied the list again. "No," he said, and took it to town himself, which she hadn't expected. She'd expected him to send Cully. He came back with most of it. He stood in the kitchen door again while she was putting it away, and she could tell he wanted to say something about the arrangement of the shelves, which she had reorganized completely from how they'd been. She could see him building up to it. She said, without turning around, "The old arrangement put the heaviest items on the highest shelves. That's how someone gets hurt and breaks what they're trying to reach. The new arrangement is organized by use and by weight. You'll find it works better." He didn't say anything about the shelves. He did say eventually, "Do you need anything else?" "Not today," Maribel said. "Ask me again in a week." He made a sound that was somewhere between acknowledgement and amusement and went back outside. By the end of the first week, she had reorganized the pantry, repaired the larder door latch, identified 3 places in the east wing where the window frames had been letting cold air through all winter, and started a conversation with Ronan's ranch cook, a lean, older man named Dort, who cooked for the hands out of a separate kitchen near the bunkhouse, about improving the quality of the bunkhouse meals with smarter use of cheaper cuts. Dort was initially suspicious of her. Most people in established positions were, at first. She didn't push. She just left a pot of her bean soup on his stove one morning with a note saying, "Tried something with your dried beans. See what you think." And she went about her work. By afternoon, Dort had appeared in the main kitchen doorway and stood there for a moment looking at her and then said gruffly, "What did you put in that?" "Little salt pork, dried thyme, a bay leaf, patience," Maribel said. "Patience," Dort said. "It's the ingredient most people leave out." He almost smiled. "Could show me sometime?" "Anytime you want," Maribel said. By the end of the second week, the mansion was different in ways that were hard to name exactly. The fires were lit properly in the evenings. The dining table had stopped looking like a surface no one used. Cully and 2 of the other ranch hands had started eating their noon meal at the kitchen table when Maribel offered it, which she did matter-of-factly and without ceremony, and they came because the food was better and stayed because the conversation was easy. Ronan noticed. He didn't say anything about it, but he noticed. And on the evening of the 14th day, he came in from the range later than usual, later than anyone should have been out, given the cold, and found a plate of supper kept warm on the back of the stove and a note in Maribel's handwriting that said, "Eat before you do anything else." He stood in the kitchen alone and ate standing at the counter, and then he looked out the window at the dark pasture for a long time. He didn't know what he was feeling, exactly. He wasn't sure he'd ever been good at that part. But the house was warm, and something that had been missing from it for a very long time was beginning, slowly, uncertainly, like a fire started with damp wood, to take hold. The third week started with a broken fence line on the north pasture, and an argument between 2 of the ranch hands over whose fault it was, and Maribel heard about both from Cully before she'd finished her first cup of coffee. She didn't involve herself in the fence line dispute. That was ranch business, and Ronan's to handle. But she filed the information away the way she filed everything, carefully, in the part of her mind where patterns lived. The north pasture fence, the creek that ran along the eastern boundary, the way the water level had dropped slightly over the past week, which she'd noticed because she walked that way on her free mornings, and she noticed things that most people didn't bother to notice. She didn't say anything yet. She needed more information before saying anything. What she did instead was finish her coffee and start on the bread, because bread was one of those things that required your hands to be busy and left your mind free to work on separate problems entirely. She had been at the Vale Ranch for 21 days. In that time, she had done what she said she would do, and Ronan had done what he agreed to do, and between them there existed a working arrangement that functioned the way a good tool functions. No friction, no wasted motion, each part doing what it was designed to do without getting in the other's way. She did not think about whether she liked him. She didn't have time to think about whether she liked him. Or that was what she told herself on the mornings when she caught herself noticing that he worked longer than any of his hands, that he asked Dort about his bad knee without making a thing of it, that he fixed the broken porch railing himself one Saturday afternoon, using the proper tools and not just a quick nail and a hope. She told herself she was observing him the way she observed everything, gathering information. She went back to her bread and tried to believe it. It was on the 23rd day that she first heard the name Silas Crowell. She was in town for supplies, the bay mare borrowed from the stable again because Ronan had told her to take one of his ranch horses, and she'd declined because she didn't want to be beholden any further than she already was. And she was coming out of the mercantile with a sack of dried apples when she heard 2 women talking on the boardwalk outside. She wasn't trying to listen. She simply had ears. "Third family this season," the taller woman was saying. "The Hartleys just gave up and moved on. Just left." Where'd they go? Who knows? East, someone said. Back to wherever they came from. Shame, the shorter woman said, but in the way people say shame when they mean it's unfortunate but not surprising and probably couldn't be helped. Crowell's men were at their place 2 days before they left, the taller woman said. That's all I know. Maribel stopped walking. She stood on the boardwalk with her sack of dried apples, and her mind went very still and cold in the way it did when something she recognized was coming into focus. She turned to the women. Excuse me, I'm sorry to interrupt. You mentioned Crowell. Silas Crowell? The taller woman looked at her with the guarded expression people used on strangers. That's right. What is he? A rancher? Land speculator, they call him, the shorter woman said. Has an office on the south end of Maine. Does a lot of business with the Territorial Land Office. She paused. You work out at the Vale place? I do, Maribel said. Something passed between the two women. Not unfriendly, but aware. Then you probably won't have to worry about Crowell, the taller one said. He doesn't go after people with 5,000 acres and private water rights. He goes after the small ones, the ones who can't fight back. Maribel thought about the Hendersons' water access that no longer existed on paper. She thought about Petey Graves in a leather satchel and 3 documents stamped in a hurry. How long has this been going on? She asked. 2 years, the taller woman said. Maybe a bit more. Maribel thanked them and walked back to the mare. She stood there for a moment before untying the reins, looking at the south end of Main Street where a sign read Crowell Land and Water Associates in the same fresh paint that always appeared on offices that wanted to look newer than they were. Then she untied the mare and rode back to the Vale Ranch. She didn't say anything to Ronan that night, or the next day. She went back to her free morning walks along the eastern fence line and looked at the creek carefully. The water level was down. Not dramatically. A person could dismiss it as seasonal variation, as the ordinary movement of water in early spring. But Maribel had grown up on a farm with a creek, and she had spent 6 years working ranches that depended on running water, and she knew the difference between seasonal variation and something else. She started asking questions in town, carefully, the way you ask when you don't want whoever you're asking to know why you want to know. No, she asked the grain merchant. She asked the woman who ran the boarding house. She asked Petey Graves himself, who was young enough and troubled enough about what he'd done that he talked more than he should have when a kind woman with gray-green eyes asked him how the land office was getting on these days. By the end of the 4th week, she knew enough. Crowell had been systematically diverting water upstream by manipulating diversion gate documentation and survey markers. The families affected were all small operations, homesteaders and small ranchers with limited legal resources and no political connections. The altered documents were filed through the Territorial Land Office, where Crowell had either paid or pressured the right people. The Hartley family's abandonment wasn't the first. It wouldn't be the last. She knew this story. She had lived inside this story once before, on a Nebraska farm that no longer belonged to her family, because a similar man with a similar leather satchel had done a similar thing. Her father had not known what to do. He had fought the only way he knew, directly, loudly, without documentation, and he had lost everything. And then he had gotten sick, and then he had died, and Maribel's mother had followed him 2 years later, and Maribel had been 22 years old with nothing left to lose, and had pointed herself west and started walking. She had spent 9 years learning what her father hadn't known. Now she was going to use it, but she needed Ronan Vale. That was the part that stuck in her throat. She was not a woman who asked for things from powerful men. She had learned over 9 years that asking gave them leverage, and leverage led to debt, and debt led to obligation, and obligation led to a very particular kind of disappearing that happened to women who owed things to men with resources. But she also knew that what she'd found was larger than what she could handle alone. Crowell had money and legal connections and armed employees. What he did not have was a neighbor with 5,000 acres and a private water source and the kind of established reputation in the territory that made other men pay attention. She needed Ronan, and she was going to have to ask. She waited until after supper, when the ranch hands had gone back to the bunkhouse, and the kitchen was clean and the house had settled into its evening quiet, which was different from the silence it used to have. Not empty anymore, just still. Ronan was at the desk in his office, a room off the front hall that he used for the ranch accounts, which were apparently always in better shape than his kitchen, and she knocked on the open door and said, "I need to talk to you about something." He looked up. He had the expression of a man interrupted mid-calculation, slightly impatient, but he set down his pen. "Sit down," he said. "I'll stand," Maribel said. "This won't take long." It took nearly an hour. She told him everything she'd found, the water diversion, the altered surveys, the pattern of families losing access to creek water and then abandoning their claims. She told him about Petey Graves and what Petey had said without meaning to say it. She told him about Crowell's land office connections and the 3 families she'd identified who were currently in the process of losing what the Hartleys had already lost. Ronan listened. I was a good listener when the subject warranted it. Still, attentive, not interrupting. His face didn't change much, but his eyes moved, which meant he was processing. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You've been investigating this for a month." 3 weeks, Maribel said. "I didn't have enough to say anything before now." "While running my household." "On my own time, mostly. Your household still got run." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "What do you want me to do about it?" And here was the part she hadn't been sure how to say. Crowell's diversion is pulling water that should be reaching the families downstream. 3 of them are already in trouble. If nothing changes, they'll be gone by fall. She paused. "You have private water rights and enough infrastructure to share. If you opened your reservoir to those families and made it public that you were doing it, Crowell loses a significant part of what he's using against them." Ronan's expression shifted. Not anger, something more careful than anger. "That would put me directly against Crowell." "Yes," Maribel said. "Crowell has lawyers and political connections in the territorial capital." "He does." "Challenging him publicly would mean a legal fight that could drag on for years and distract from—" "I know," Maribel said. "I know exactly what it means. I'm not asking you to do it blind. I'm telling you what I know and what I think should happen, and you can do what you want with it." She looked at him squarely. "But those families are running out of time. And you're the only person in this valley who has enough standing to make Crowell think twice before he stamps the next set of documents." The office was quiet. Somewhere outside, one of the horses shifted and the barn groaned slightly in the wind. Ronan stood up from his desk and walked to the window and stood with his back to her, looking out at the dark. "My father built this ranch," he said after a while. "Started with 300 acres and a water claim that 2 other men contested. He fought for 10 years to establish what we have. Every time he got involved in other people's fights, it cost us." He paused. "I learned that early. Stay inside your own fences." "That's a reasonable way to survive," Maribel said. "But," he turned from the window, "you're powerful because everyone in this valley knows you'll defend what's yours." She kept her voice even, not pushing too hard because pushing too hard on this kind of man always had the opposite effect. "Maybe it's time they learned you'll defend what's right." Something crossed his face. Not quite guilt. Something older than guilt and harder to name. "Maribel," he said, and it was the first time he'd used her name without the miss in front of it, which neither of them acknowledged but both of them heard. "If I do this, if I go after Crowell publicly, he'll come back at me with everything he has." "I know. And if he finds a way to damage my water claim or my land documentation—" "He won't," Maribel said. "Not if we do it right. Your documentation is already solid. I looked." She said it simply, because it was simply true, and she watched his expression do the small, complicated thing it did when something she said surprised him. "I checked your original survey records against the county files last week. Everything you have is properly registered and triple verified. Crowell can't touch what's already clean." Another long silence. Ronan said, "You checked my land documentation." "On my free day," Maribel said. "In case it was relevant. It is." He looked at her for a long time. The lamp on his desk threw warm light across the room, and outside the window, the Montana sky was doing what it did in late spring, holding the last of the dusk longer than seemed reasonable, as if the dark wasn't quite ready to commit. "I'll think about it," he said. Maribel nodded. She had expected not better than this. "Take the time you need," she said, "but not too much time." She went back to the kitchen and made herself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table and thought about her father, who had been a good man and not a powerful one, and about the gap between those two things and how little being good was worth when you were facing someone who used power without mercy. She thought about Ronan Vale, who was powerful, and, she was beginning to believe despite her intentions, also a better man than he showed easily. She drank her tea and went to bed. 2 days passed. Ronan said nothing about their conversation. The ranch operated normally. Maribel preserved the first of the spring root vegetables, taught Cully how to properly bank a fire so it lasted through a cold night, and walked the creek line twice more to confirm what she already knew about the water level. On the third morning, Ronan appeared at the kitchen door while she was starting breakfast and said, "I'm going to open the reservoir to the Henderson and Calloway families. I'll tell them this week." Maribel did not turn from the stove. "And the Fielding homestead?" A pause. "Them too. And you'll make it public?" "I'll make it a known," he said, which was not quite the same thing but was close enough for now. She turned and looked at him. He looked like a man who had made a decision that he knew was going to cost him and had decided to make it anyway, and there was something in that, in the deliberateness of it, the clear-eyed acceptance, that she found she could not look at for too long. "All right," she said, "thank you." He made the sound he made when gratitude made him uncomfortable, somewhere between acknowledgement and dismissal, and went back outside. She turned back to the stove. Her heart was doing something she told it firmly to stop. The announcement that Ronan Vale was sharing his water access with 3 homestead families spread through Red Willow the way all news spread through small towns, fast, through every channel simultaneously, arriving at every ear in a slightly different version of itself. By the time the week was out, some people had Ronan sharing his entire ranch. Others had him doing it under some kind of legal pressure. And a small, accurate group simply noted that Ronan Vale had done something unexpected and watched to see what happened next. What happened next was Silas Crowell. Maribel heard about it from Cully, who had been in town for nails and come back with considerably more information than nails. Crowell was at the saloon, Cully said, setting the nails on the kitchen table and looking at Maribel with the expression of someone delivering news they're not sure how the recipient will receive. "Talking about Mr. Vale, said some things." "What kind of things?" "The kind a man says when he wants other men to know he's angry without saying he's angry." Cully picked up one of the nails and turned it in his fingers. "He said Mr. Vale was a man who didn't understand the difference between charity and business. Said opening the water to those homesteaders was going to cause problems for the whole valley because it set expectations that couldn't be sustained." He paused. "And then he said something about how it was a shame when a man's personal associations started affecting his business judgment." The kitchen was very quiet. "Personal associations," Maribel repeated. "Yes, ma'am." She understood immediately what Crowell was implying, that Ronan's decision had been influenced by a woman on his ranch, that the woman, who was large, who was a hired hand, who had no family name in this territory, had gotten into the wealthy cattleman's head and clouded his thinking. It was, she had to admit, a precise and vicious thing to say. "Does Mr. Vale know?" she asked. "Not yet," Cully said. "I came back here first." "Good," Maribel said. "I'll tell him myself." She told him that evening. She gave it to him straight, without softening, because he was not a man who needed softening, and doing it would have insulted them both. She told him what Crowell had said and what it implied, and watched his face go through 3 distinct expressions in quick succession. First the flat calm that wasn't calm, then something that might have been anger, then something colder and more deliberate than anger. "He'll try to make this about you," Ronan said, "to make me look like I was manipulated." "Yes," Maribel said. "It's a clean move. If you retreat, he wins the water argument and damages your reputation. If you hold, he'll push harder and look for something else to use." She looked at him steadily. "It's what men like him do. They find the thing that makes you look weak, and they say it loudly in public until it's all anyone can see. What do you want to do?" She had not expected that question in that form. What do you want to do? Not what do you suggest or what are your thoughts, but an equal question asked to an equal person. It took her a half-second to adjust. "I want to keep going," she said. "He's rattled enough to make noise this quickly, which means we got closer to something real than he wanted us to get. Rattled men make mistakes." She paused. "But I think we need to find out how far the falsified documentation goes. I've seen the pattern before. It's never just water diversion. There are usually altered survey markers, and if there are altered markers, there are usually county records that don't match the original filings." "You'd know what to look for," Ronan said. Not a question. "I'd know exactly what to look for," Maribel said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, My grandfather kept copies of every survey filing in this county going back to 1851. They're in the back of the document room. Maribel looked at him. You have original county surveys. Copies. But certified copies, properly witnessed. He paused. My grandfather didn't trust the land office. Your grandfather, Maribel said slowly, was a very wise man. The corner of his mouth moved. He was a suspicious man, but in this case it amounts to the same thing. They went to the document room together that evening and stayed there for 3 hours, which was not a thing that either of them had planned, and which turned out to mean that Cully had to take the front room fire duty because no one had told him not to, and he did it without complaint and only let it get slightly too low before he caught it. The document room was at the back of the east wing, a long, narrow room lined with shelves that held the accumulated paper history of the Vale Ranch, going back to its first establishment. Ronan's grandfather had been, as advertised, extremely thorough and extremely suspicious, and the result was a complete set of land records that most ranches of this era did not have. Maribel worked through them with the methodical focus she brought to every task that required it. She had Ronan pull the surveys for the land sections adjacent to Crowell's current operations, and she laid them out on the long table and compared them to the notes she had made from the county records she'd examined in town. It took an hour to find the first discrepancy. Here, she said, putting her finger on a line in a survey filed in 1873. This boundary marker, Creek Bend, northeast quarter of Section 11. She pulled the county copy she had notated from town. In the county record, the same marker is listed differently. The bearing is off by enough that it shifts the eastern boundary of the Fielding claim approximately 40 feet. Ronan leaned over the table. He was close enough that she was aware of it, and she moved her attention firmly back to the documents. 40 feet, he said. That's not much. It is when those 40 feet include the only part of the Fielding property that has direct creek access, Maribel said. If the boundary is where Crowell's version says it is, the Fielding's direct water access is legally on his land, not theirs. Ronan was very still. That's what he's doing, Maribel said. The water diversion slows the flow and damages the homesteads. But the altered surveys are what makes it legal, or what makes it look legal. He's not just cutting off their water. He's rewriting the records to show that the water was never rightfully theirs. The room's very quiet. How long would it take to document all of this properly? Ronan asked. If I have access to these records and can get back into the county files, maybe 2 weeks, maybe 3. Enough to bring to a territorial judge with witnesses. Ronan straightened up. His face had the look it had when he made decisions. Not comfortable exactly, but resolved. Then we start tomorrow. Maribel said. You can't walk into a territorial judge's office alone, he said, not unkindly. That's not how it works, and you know it. You need someone with standing in this territory. She knew it. She had known it since she started. It still sat badly. I know, she said. I'm not trying to take over your work, he said. I'm trying to make sure it counts. She looked at him for a moment. He held the look the way he usually held things she threw at him. Steady, not defensive. Fine, she said. Tomorrow. They worked for the next 10 days. Maribel organized and cataloged. Ronan used his territorial contacts to request additional county records through channels that moved faster than they would have for a woman working alone. Cully drove them to the county seat twice, sitting on the wagon box with the cheerful patience of someone who understood he was adjacent to something important, even if he didn't know all the details. The picture that emerged was worse than Maribel had initially estimated. Crowell had been altering survey documentation for at least 4 years. The water diversion was part of it, but the core of the scheme was boundary manipulation, small adjustments to filed surveys that, when accumulated, effectively relocated creek access points from homesteaders' claims to land that Crowell either already held or was in the process of acquiring. 5 families had already lost claims they had no idea they'd lost. 3 more were currently in the process of losing them. On the 11th, Maribel set down the last of the county filings and sat back in her chair in the document room and looked at everything spread across the table. Ronan was across from her, reading through the witness statements they'd collected from Petey Graves and 2 other land office workers who, once Ronan Vale asked them directly and seriously, found they had quite a lot they'd been wanting to say. It's enough, Maribel said. Ronan looked up. It's enough to take to a judge, she said. Maybe more than enough. He looked at the table, at the documents and the notes and the careful comparison charts she had drawn up, lining county records against Vale survey copies line by line, discrepancy by discrepancy. "You built this," he said, "this whole case." "You opened the doors that got me the records," Maribel said. "That's not the same as doing the work." "No," she agreed, "but it mattered." He looked at her with an expression she was having increasing difficulty categorizing, which was itself a problem she didn't want to think about too carefully. "What happens," he said, "when Crowell finds out we have all of this?" Maribel thought about the leather satchel, about Petey Graves's white face, about the Hartley family who'd packed up and left without a fight because no one had shown them there was a fight worth having. "He'll move faster," she said. "He'll try to finish what he's doing before we can get to a judge. He'll push harder on the remaining families. He'll possibly try to find a way to discredit the evidence." She paused. "Or he'll try to come at us directly." Ronan was quiet for a moment. "Let him," he said. It wasn't bravado. It was the flat, considered voice of a man who had decided something and meant it completely. Maribel looked at him for a moment. Then she began organizing the documents into the leather folio she'd bought in town for exactly this purpose. She did not let herself think about how tired she was, or about the fact that it was almost midnight and the house was completely quiet around them, or about how she had not expected 6 weeks ago on a grain merchant's wagon that Red Willow would turn out to be the place where she finally stopped running from the thing that had taken everything from her family. She did not let herself think about any of that. She organized the documents carefully, tied the folio closed, and said, "We should ride to the county seat by the end of the week." "I'll tell Cully to have the wagon ready Thursday," Ronan said. "Good," Maribel said. She stood up and took the folio under her arm and walked toward the door. "Maribel," Ronan said. She stopped. "What Crowell said in the saloon," Ronan said, "about personal associations affecting my judgment." She turned enough to look at him. His face was doing the complicated thing it did when he was working out how to say something he hadn't said before. "He wasn't entirely wrong," Ronan said, "that you've affected things here." He stopped, started again. "But not the way he meant it. Not like a weakness." Maribel looked at him steadily. "I know," she said quietly. Then she walked out of the document room and down the hall to her room in the East Wing, and she set the folio on the table by the window where she could see it, and she sat on the edge of the bed for a long time looking at it. Outside, the spring wind moved through the cottonwoods along the creek. The water was still lower than it should have been, but they knew why now, and they knew what to do. What they didn't know was that Silas Crowell had a man watching the Vale Ranch, and that man had watched the lights burning in the back of the East Wing until well past midnight for the past 10 days, and Crowell already knew they were coming. Thursday came with a sky the color of old pewter and a wind that had teeth in it. Cully had the wagon ready before dawn the way Ronan had asked, the 2 draft horses standing patient and steaming in the cold, their breath making small clouds in the gray morning air. Maribel had the folio wrapped in oilcloth and tucked inside her coat, against her body, because the sky looked like it meant what it was threatening, and she was not going to let 3 weeks of documented evidence get rained on. She came out the kitchen door and found Ronan already at the wagon, checking the harness with the focused attention he gave to anything mechanical. He had his heavy coat on and his rifle in the saddle scabbard on the wagon side, which she noted without comment. He was a man who read weather and prepared accordingly, and the weather this morning said something was coming. Cully climbed to the box. Maribel and Ronan took the bench seat behind him. They were 2 miles down the creek road when the first rider appeared. He came out of the tree line on the east side of the road at a pace that was too deliberate to be accidental and stopped his horse sideways across the track in the way men stopped horses when they wanted you to understand the stop was intentional. He was broad through the shoulders and had the blank, professionally disinterested face of a man paid to be present rather than to think. Behind him, 2 more riders emerged from the trees. Cully pulled the draft horses to a halt without being told. Ronan said nothing. He sat on the wagon bench with his hands loose in his lap and looked at the rider blocking the road with the patience of a man who had all morning. The rider said, "Mr. Crowell sends his regards, Mr. Vale. He'd like you to reconsider your plans for the county seat." "Does he?" Ronan said. "He thinks there may have been some misunderstanding about the survey records. He'd like the opportunity to clarify things before any formal proceedings." "The records are clear enough," Ronan said. I don't think clarification is what Mr. Crowell is after. The rider shifted his weight. He glanced at Maribel once, a brief, assessing look of the particular kind that men gave women they had been briefed to consider a problem. Then back to Ronan. Mr. Crowell would also like to point out that the territorial judge's docket is quite full this time of year. Could be months before a hearing is scheduled. A lot can happen to a ranch's water situation in a few months, he paused, and other situations. The wind moved through the cottonwoods along the creek. In the silence it made, that last sentence sat like a stone in still water. Maribel felt Ronan go still beside her. Not afraid still, a different kind of still, the stillness of something deciding. She said before he could respond, "Tell Mr. Crowell that we appreciate the message, and tell him we'll be at the county seat by noon." The rider looked at her. Something moved across his blank face. Surprise, maybe? Or the recalculation of a man who had not expected to be spoken to by the woman. "Ma'am," he started. "We'll be at the county seat by noon," Maribel repeated in exactly the same tone. She did not raise her voice. She did not look away. A long beat. The rider looked back at Ronan. Ronan said, "You heard her." The rider held for another moment. Then he pulled his horse sideways, and the two men behind him moved with him, clearing the road. Cully clicked to the draft horses and the wagon moved forward, and Maribel did not look back at the three riders as they passed, because looking back would have been the wrong kind of message. She felt her heart beating harder than she showed. Beside her, Ronan said quietly, "That was a threat." "Yes," Maribel said, "a fairly direct one." "Which means he's more rattled than I thought," she said. "Rattled men send riders to block roads. Confident men wait and let the legal system work for them." She adjusted the oilcloth around the folio. "He doesn't think the legal system is going to work for him this time. That's useful information." Ronan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Are you always this calm when someone just threatened your safety on a public road?" "No," Maribel said honestly. "But I've learned not to show the part that isn't calm, because that's usually what they're waiting for." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she did not examine too closely. "Right," he said, and they rode the rest of the way to the county seat without speaking about it again. The territorial judge's name was Aldous Fry, and he was 70 years old and small and lean and had the demeanor of a man who had spent 40 years listening to people try to deceive him and had developed very good instincts for it. He received Ronan because Ronan Vale was a man of standing, and a judge received men of standing. He looked at Maribel with the careful neutrality of a man of his generation confronted with a woman who had clearly come to do business rather than accompany someone. Maribel spread the documents on his desk and walked him through them without preamble and without apology, the way you walk someone through evidence when the evidence is sufficient, and the only thing that can hurt you is uncertainty about your own argument. Judge Fry asked 6 questions. They were good questions, specific, legally pointed, aimed at the joints of the argument where it might flex under pressure. Maribel answered 5 of them from the documents. The 6th she answered from memory, citing the original survey filing number and the discrepancy measurement to 2 decimal points, because she had read that document 11 times and had the numbers the way she had recipes. Not memorized by effort, just known. Judge Fry looked at her over his reading glasses for a moment. Then he looked at Ronan. "Your household manager," he said. "Yes," Ronan said. The judge looked back at Maribel. "This is thorough work, Miss Shaw." "Thank you," Maribel said. "Will you hear the case?" "I'll do more than hear it," Judge Fry said. "I'm going to issue a temporary cessation order on any further land or water document filings connected to Crowell Land and Water Associates pending full review." He paused. "That means no new stamps, no new boundary adjustments, and no more families losing claims they shouldn't be losing." He reached for his pen. "And I'm going to want to talk to your Mr. Graves." They were back on the road by 2 in the afternoon. The 3 riders were gone. Cully whistled something tuneless and cheerful from the wagon box. Maribel sat with the empty oilcloth in her lap. The folio had stayed with Judge Fry, properly receipted, and looked at the road ahead and felt the particular exhaustion that comes after a long tension releases. Not relief exactly, more like the sudden awareness of how heavy something was now that you'd put it down. Ronan said, "He'll fight the cessation order." "He will," Maribel agreed. "Lawyers, delays, appeals." "All of that," she said. "But the documentation is solid, and he knows it. Every delay he creates gives us more time to find more records." She looked at the road. He can fight for a while. He can't win. Ronan said, How do you know that? She thought about how to answer honestly. Because I've seen this twice now. Once from the losing side, when I was too young and my father didn't have what we have, and once from here. She looked at him. The difference between those two situations is what you've given me access to. The records, the standing, the contacts. She paused. This time the documentation is complete and the judge is paying attention. That changes everything. He was quiet for a while. The wagon moved through the late afternoon light, and the creek road opened up around a bend and the Vale Ranch came into view in the distance, the mansion catching the low sun on its western windows. When you first came here, Ronan said, and I offered you the room and the wage, I thought I was solving a problem I had. Someone to run the house. You were, Maribel said. I wasn't thinking about what you might need, whether this was useful to you. She looked at him directly. He was looking at the road, not at her, which might have been why he was saying it. It was, she said. The access mattered, and the time. She hesitated, then added, because it was true, and she wasn't someone who withheld true things without reason. This is the first place in 6 years where I've been long enough to actually do something, not just survive and move on. He nodded slowly. It was not a small nod. They got back to the ranch an hour before supper, and Maribel went straight to the kitchen and started cooking because her hands needed to be busy, and her mind needed the particular quiet that only came when she was doing something she knew how to do without thinking. Cully came and went through the kitchen 3 times, each time finding some reason to be near the stove, which meant he was hungry and also curious about how things had gone, but too polite to ask directly. On the 3rd pass, Maribel said, It went well. Tell Dort and the others. Cully said, Yes, ma'am, and disappeared with the speed of someone who had information to deliver. She heard his voice in the yard a minute later, talking to 2 of the ranch hands. And she heard the particular quality that good news has when it travels through a small community of people who've been quietly worried about something. She turned back to the stove and found that the ache behind her eyes had eased. It lasted 11 days. 11 days of ordinary ranch life, which was not ordinary in the way cities are ordinary, but was its own reliable rhythm. Early mornings, cold, work, meals, the specific community of people who lived in proximity to a shared purpose. The cessation order had been served. Crowell had gone quiet in public while his lawyers went loud in private, which was exactly what Maribel had predicted. 3 of the Homestead families sent letters of thanks to the ranch, which Maribel read privately in the kitchen and set aside without showing to anyone. The Fielding family came in person. Abel Fielding was 54 years old, wide through the chest, with the weathered look of a man who had farmed in hard conditions for a long time. He came with his wife Clara and their youngest son, and he stood in the front room of the Vale mansion turning his hat in his hands and said, very simply, that he didn't know how to thank a person for something this large. Maribel said, You held your claim long enough for someone to find the evidence. That's not nothing. Abel Fielding looked at her for a moment. His wife reached over and briefly touched Maribel's hand, which was the gesture of a woman who understood that the person across from her had done something real at real cost and didn't have words for it, and was offering what she had instead. Maribel held very still until they were gone, and then went back to the kitchen and stood at the sink for a moment doing nothing, which was not something she did often. Ronan found her there. He didn't say anything. He went to the other side of the kitchen and poured himself a cup of coffee and stood there drinking it, which was his way of saying that he was present if she wanted company and could disappear if she didn't. She appreciated it more than she showed. He'll come back, she said, after a while. Not about the Fieldings. I know, Ronan said. We should be ready. We will be, he said. She nodded and turned back to what she was doing. And then November arrived. It came the way Montana November came when it meant business. Not gradually, not with warning, but with a single night that changed everything. Maribel woke at 4 a.m. to the sound of a different kind of wind, one that didn't move through things but pressed against them, and she knew before she looked out the window what she would see. Snow. Heavy, sideways driven, the kind that didn't fall so much as a tack. She was dressed and in the kitchen before 5, starting the stove and beginning an inventory of what they had, because if she was reading the sky correctly, and she was this was not a 2-day storm. Ronan appeared at 5:30, looking like a man who had also woken knowing something was wrong. "How bad?" he said. "Bad," Maribel said. "How are the cattle?" "Cully's already out. We're moving them to the South Pasture shelter." "The barn roof on the east side, the one with the soft section." "I know about it," Ronan said, which meant he knew and hadn't gotten to it before winter, which neither of them wasted time addressing because it was the past. "I'm reinforcing it today." "I'll start on the food stores," Maribel said. She had, as it turned out, been preparing for exactly this. This was the thing that no one on the Vale Ranch had fully understood yet, including Ronan, because Maribel had done it quietly, without announcement, over the course of her months there. Every free morning, every trip to town that included a little more than the list required, every canning session that ran longer than necessary, every time she'd asked Cully to bring in an extra cord of wood, and he'd done it without asking why. She'd been building. Not because she'd known the blizzard was coming, but because she knew enough about frontier winters and isolated ranches and the particular danger of being caught without resources to understand that preparation was not excessive. It was the only sane response to conditions that didn't care about your plans. The smokehouse was full. The larder had 3 months of preserved vegetables, dried meat, flour, salt, dried beans, and a supply of medicinal herbs she'd identified and dried through the fall. Yarrow for fever, willow bark for pain, dried anxiety that came with sustained crisis. The wood was stacked in the protected alcove on the west side of the house where the snow wouldn't block it. The candles and lamp oil were more than sufficient. By noon, the storm had become something else entirely. The wind was loud enough to make conversation difficult outdoors. 3 of the ranch hands came in from the south pasture saying 2 of the cattle shelters were holding, but a third had lost part of its east wall. They'd managed to get most of the cattle moved, but not all. Then came the first knock at the door. It was the Henderson family. Father, mother, 3 children, the youngest not yet walking, all of them coated in ice and the children crying. The way children cry when they have been cold long enough to forget being warm. Their cabin's roof had failed on the south side. They had nowhere else to go. Maribel had them inside before they finished explaining. She put the children by the kitchen stove with warm blankets and a pot of broth she'd had going since mid-morning. She set the parents in front of the front room fire with dry clothes pulled from the chest, in the spare room that she had stocked 2 weeks ago, with extra clothing in several sizes, because she'd had a feeling she couldn't fully explain, and she had long ago learned to respect feelings she couldn't fully explain. Ronan watched this operation from the doorway of the front room. He said nothing. He got out of the way. The second knock came an hour later. The Calloway family, an older couple and their adult son, whose well had frozen and whose livestock were in danger. Ronan and 2 ranch hands went out with them to deal with the animals. Maribel received the Calloways and put them in the east wing rooms. By 3 in the afternoon, the mansion had 11 additional people in it, and the blizzard was still building. By 5, it was 15, including a trapper who had gotten turned around on the north road and found the lights of the Vale house through the snow and nearly wept when Cully opened the door. And then, at 6 o'clock, with the wind at its worst and every fireplace in the house burning, and the kitchen in a state of controlled, intense activity that Maribel was managing the way a river manages floodwater set. By finding every channel and pushing it in a useful direction, Cully appeared at the kitchen door with his face tight and said, "Part of the horse barn collapsed. The east section. The soft roof that Ronan hadn't gotten to before winter, and inside it, 6 horses." Ronan was already moving. He had his coat and his rope before Cully finished explaining. "I'm going with you," 2 of the ranch hands said, coming in from the hallway. "And me," said the Henderson father, who had been sitting useless by the fire for 2 hours and clearly couldn't stand it anymore. Maribel was already at the coat pegs. Ronan said, "You stay inside." She turned and looked at him. "Maribel." His voice was the voice he used when he was frightened for someone, which she had heard once before and recognized. "You don't need to—" "Those horses are panicking," she said. "Panicking horses injure people who don't know how to calm them. I know how to calm them." She put on her coat. "And if we go out in that without a rope line, we'll lose people in the whiteout before we reach the barn, which is 40 feet away." A beat. "She's right," Cully said, which took some courage given the expression on Ronan's face. Ronan looked at Maribel for a long moment. His jaw was tight. His eyes were doing the particular thing they did when he was weighing something against his will. Rope line, he said. You stay in the middle. Fine, Maribel said. They went out into the blizzard. 40 feet had never been longer. The wind was a physical thing, not a force, but a presence, pushing from every direction simultaneously and stealing warmth with a speed that was almost personal. The snow was not falling, it was flying, horizontal, coating faces, and filling mouths if you were foolish enough to open them. The rope connected 7 people in a line from the house to the barn, and it was the only reliable thing in the white. The barn, when they reached it, was chaos. The east section had come down not completely but badly. A section of roof beam had dropped and taken part of the wall with it, and the snow was coming in through the gap, and the 6 horses were in the part of the barn that was still standing, 3 of them pressed against the far wall, and 2 of them moving in the dangerous circular way that meant the panic was building towards something worse. The 6th was down. Maribel went to the 6th horse first. It was a gray mare named Sable. She knew all the horses by name by now, which was the kind of thing that happened when you spent enough mornings walking the pasture. And Sable was down on her left side with her legs moving in the dreaming, running way that could mean several things, none of them good. Maribel knelt in the hay and snow and put her hand on Sable's neck and spoke to her. Not words exactly, sound. The low, unhurried, continuous kind of sound that lived below the register of human language and in the register that horses understood, which was warmth and presence, and the message that whatever was happening, something steady, was here now. Sable's legs slowed. She's not injured, Maribel said, loudly enough to be heard over the wind through the gap. She's shocked. Get her up. The ranch hands and Ronan and Henderson worked on Sable, while Maribel moved to the 2 circling horses and did the same thing. Presence, sound, the deliberate invasion of their panic with something calmer. It was not quick, and it was not clean. The 2nd horse knocked her sideways with his shoulder, and she went into the wall hard enough to knock the breath out of her, and she got up and kept going. It took 40 minutes to get all 6 horses settled and moved to the intact west section of the barn, and jury-rigged a barrier to block the gap enough to cut the wind. When they got back inside, Maribel's coat was crusted with ice, and her left shoulder ached from where the horse had sent her into the wall, and her feet had passed through numb and were now doing something more interesting and unpleasant. She went to the kitchen and stood in front of the stove until she felt her feet again, which took longer than she would have liked and hurt more than she showed. Ronan appeared beside her. He looked at her face and then at her shoulder and then back at her face. "You're hurt," he said. "I'm fine," she said. "Your shoulder is fine," she said. "Nothing's broken. I'd know." He looked at her for a long moment. His face was doing a complicated thing she didn't have the energy to interpret right now. "Sit down," he said. "There are 20 people in this house who need. Cully's got the kitchen. Clara Henderson is helping with the children. Sit down, Maribel." She sat down. It came as something of a relief, which she would have preferred not to show, but she was too tired to manage the performance of being less tired than she was. Ronan had found the small jar of comfrey salve on the 2nd shelf of the larder, the one she'd made in October from plants she'd found along the creek, without being told where it was, which meant he'd been paying more attention to the kitchen shelves than he'd let on. He handed it to her. She applied it herself. He didn't offer to do it for her, and she appreciated that. "How long have you been storing things?" he asked, sitting across from her while she worked the salve into her shoulder through her shirt. "Since the 3rd week," she said. "A little at a time, nothing dramatic, just—" She looked for the word. "Margin. Building margin." "I noticed the pantry was fuller than I expected," he said. "I thought you'd overbought." "I'd appropriately bought," she said, "for conditions that might come." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind had taken on the deep register it hit when it settled in for a long storm, the sound that meant this was not passing tonight or tomorrow. 20 people, he said, "in this house." 22 if you count the trapper's dog, Maribel said. Something crossed his face. "There's a dog." "In the mudroom." Dort fed him. Ronan pressed his hand over his eyes for a moment in the gesture of a man who was somehow both exhausted and reluctantly amused. "Of course." "They're fed," Maribel said. "They're warm. The children are settled. The horses are secure enough for tonight. We have enough food for 4 days without restocking. The fires will hold." She looked at him. "The house is doing what a house is supposed to do." He put his hand down and looked at her. And there it was again. That thing in his face that she kept not having the time to examine properly, except that now she was sitting down and the crisis had moved into its holding pattern, and she was too tired to keep not looking at it. He said very quietly, "That's your problem, Ronan. You think being strong means carrying everything alone." It took her a half second to understand that he was quoting her back to herself, something she'd said to him. When, exactly? In the office. In the early weeks when she'd first brought him the Crowell evidence and he'd said he'd handled things alone for 20 years, she hadn't realized he'd held on to it. "Tonight you're learning different," he continued, still in that quiet voice that wasn't performing anything. Maribel looked at him steadily. "You remembered that," she said. "I remember most things you say," he said, with the plain, slightly uncomfortable directness of a man delivering a truth. He hasn't figured out how to be comfortable with yet. The kitchen was warm. The sound of the storm outside made the inside feel more inside than usual. From the front room came the muffled voices of the Henderson children, and somewhere in the house someone was laughing at something, the genuine, unpracticed kind, and the sound traveled through the walls and reached the kitchen the way warmth traveled through a well-built house, slowly, steadily, filling every corner it could find. Maribel said, "I'm going to need help tomorrow. The Fielding family might try to come in if the storm holds another day. We need to send riders before first light to check the South Creek Road." "Cully and Davis," Ronan said. "I'll have them ready. And the East Barn section needs a proper assessment at dawn. If the beam shifted further, we'll need to shore it up before more snow loads on. I'll do it myself. Take someone with you," she said. "Not alone." He nodded. She pushed herself to her feet. Her shoulder protested. She didn't sit back down. There were still 22 people and one borrowed dog in the Vale mansion, and someone needed to organize the morning, and that someone was Maribel Shaw. But for just one moment, standing in the warm kitchen with the storm pressing against the walls and the sound of people filling the rooms that had been empty for so long, she let herself feel the full weight of what this place had become. She had built this. Not the walls, not the chimneys or the timber framing, but the warmth inside them. And somewhere below the tiredness and the aching shoulder and the long list of tomorrow's tasks, she felt something she had not felt in a very long time, like this was exactly where she was supposed to be. Then she put on her apron and went back to work, because 22 people and one dog needed breakfast in 7 hours, and margin didn't build itself. What she didn't know, what none of them knew in the warmth of the crowded mansion, was that the storm had done something else in the night. Crowell's diversion gate, the illegal one upstream, had taken damage from the ice pressure, and when it failed, it wasn't going to fail quietly. The sound came just before dawn. Not the wind, which had been constant and expected and had become over the past 30 hours, something the house had simply incorporated into its noise the way you incorporate a neighbor's dog barking. Present, acknowledged, no longer alarming. This was different. Lower. A sustained pressure sound that Maribel felt in her chest before she heard it properly, the way you feel a coming train before it arrives. She was already awake. She had been awake for most of the night in the checking way that she'd never quite shaken. The farmer's daughter habit of waking at odd hours to assess conditions, to listen for what the dark was doing. She was in the kitchen with the stove banked up and a cup of coffee that had gone cold in her hands, going over the supply situation in her head for the 4th time, when the sound reached her. She set the cup down. She went to the back window and looked out toward the creek. The snow had slowed in the last hour. Not stopped, but thinned enough that the sky had turned from complete black to the particular dark gray that meant dawn was coming. The creek was not visible from this window, but the field between the house and the tree line along the creek bank was, and what Maribel saw in that field made her go very still. The field was reflecting light, not snow reflection, something else, something moving. She was in Ronan's bedroom doorway in less than a minute. "Get up," she said. "Right now." The diversion gate failed. Ronan was a man who woke fast. It was one of the things about him she had catalogued without intending to. He went from asleep to standing in the time it took her to say it twice, and he was at the window and seeing what she meant before he'd finished pulling on his boots. "How long ago?" he said. Not a question, a calculation. "I don't know, I just saw it." "If the ice backed up upstream when the gate was damaged..." He stopped. His face did the particular thing it did when he was running numbers he didn't like. The lower settlement, the Fielding place, and the two homesteads below them. Yes, Maribel said. He was already moving. I need to get down there. You need to wake Cully and Davis first and get them on horses, because one man on a flooding creek road in the dark is a dead man. She said it flat and fast because there was no time for gentle. And I need you to tell me where your secondary drainage channels are on the east property line, because if we can open them before the water crests, we may be able to redirect enough flow to slow it. He stopped, turned. She saw him absorb this, the fact that she was already 3 moves ahead, that she'd been working the problem before she'd even come to wake him, that what she was offering wasn't alarm but a partial solution. East fence line, he said, about half a mile out. There are 2 hand-cut drainage channels my father put in for spring runoff. They run toward the low meadow. Are they gated? Simple plank gates. Pull the plank, water runs through. How hard to find in the dark? With a lantern and someone who knows the land. He paused. I know where they are. Then you take the channels, Maribel said. I'll get the hands moving on the lower settlement warning. He looked at her for exactly 1 second. You're not going to the settlement alone, he said. I'm not planning to, she said. I'm going to wake Cully. She was out the door before he could say anything else. What happened in the next hour was not orderly. Orderly was not a word that belonged anywhere near a pre-dawn flood warning in the middle of a Montana blizzard, with 20 exhausted people sleeping in unfamiliar rooms. What it was instead was fast. The particular fast that comes from people who have been through enough hard things to skip the part where they stand around figuring out if it's real. Cully was awake and dressed and outside in 4 minutes. Davis, the senior ranch hand, took another 2 minutes but made up for it by appearing already saddled, having apparently anticipated something of this nature with the equanimity of a man who had worked Montana winters for 15 years. Abel Henderson was up. He was not a ranch hand and he was not young, but he was a man whose family's land was downstream, and he came out of the east wing room with his coat half on and his face set in the way of a man who had decided he was going to be useful regardless of what anyone said about it. You know the creek road below the fielding place? Cully asked him. Like my own kitchen, Henderson said. Ride with me. They went. Ronan took Davis and 2 of the other hands and headed for the east fence line with a lantern, and the grim focus of a man riding toward a problem he understood and intended to solve by hand. Maribel stood in the doorway for a moment after they'd gone, listening to the dark. The sound was louder now, closer. She went back inside. Clara Henderson was already up, moving through the mansion with the quiet competence of a woman who understood that the best thing she could do in a crisis was make sure the non-crisis parts kept functioning. She was warming milk for the children without being asked. The trapper was awake and sitting in the front room looking slightly useless, which meant he needed a job. Maribel gave him one. Keep the fires going in this room and the east wing, both of them, all morning. Don't let either one drop below this. She showed him the level with her hand. Can you do that? Yes, ma'am, he said, and looked relieved. She went back to the kitchen and started the largest pot of water she had heating, because she didn't know yet what the morning was going to bring back through that door, but she knew from experience it would involve cold, wet people, and hot water was never the wrong preparation. The Fielding family arrived at 8:15. They came on foot. Their horses had panicked when the water reached the barn and gotten loose, which Abel Fielding told her while his wife Clara sat at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee and her eyes somewhere else entirely. 2 of their 3 children were fine. The youngest, a boy of about 7, had gone down in the mud on the path to the road, and his father had pulled him up and carried him the last quarter mile. And the boy was not injured, but he was cold in the deep way that needed slow warming, not fast, and Maribel knew the difference. She put him near the stove, not next to it, not in front of it, but in the warm radius where the heat was ambient rather than direct. And she gave him warm broth, and she watched his color the way she would have watched a patient. The second homestead family, the Burkes, came 20 minutes behind the Fieldings. Their cabin had not flooded, but the road below their property had been submerged enough to cut them off from the town side, and they had come toward the Vale Ranch because it was higher ground and they didn't know where else to go. Maribel received them all. She did it without ceremony and without making anyone feel like a burden, which was its own skill. The skill of making space for people who were ashamed of needing space, who apologized for coming, who stood in the doorway looking at the full house and said things like, "We don't want to be any trouble," when what they meant was, "We had nowhere else." Sit down, she told every one of them. Eat something. Tell me what you need. By 9 o'clock, there were 31 people in the Vale mansion. 31 people, 4 dogs. The trappers had been joined by the Fieldings' cattle dog and the Burke's ancient hound, and a state of organized complexity that Maribel was managing from the kitchen the way a general manages a field, by knowing where every resource was and what it was doing and who needed it next. She was not graceful about it. She was sharp-edged and direct, and occasionally too blunt with people who were moving too slowly in spaces she needed to move through. And twice she said things she immediately knew were harsher than they needed to be. She apologized both times, quickly and without drama, and kept moving. Nobody expected perfection. What they needed was someone who knew what to do. Ronan came back at 9:40. He came through the kitchen door with mud to his knees and ice in his beard, and the look of a man who had been fighting something physical for several hours and had not entirely won, but had not entirely lost either. Both channels are open, he said. It's redirecting. Not enough to stop the flooding on the lower road, but enough to slow the crest. He looked around the kitchen, at the organized chaos, at the people moving through it, at the children by the stove. How many? 31, Maribel said, plus dogs. Sit down. I'll get you something. I don't need Sit down, Ronan. He sat down. She put coffee and a bowl of the bean soup that had been going since 6 in the morning in front of him, and he ate without argument, which told her more about how tired he was than anything else would have. Cully came back at 10. The news he carried was the kind that changes a morning's shape completely. He sat across from Ronan at the kitchen table, still in his wet coat, and said, "The main section of Crowell's diversion isn't just damaged, it's gone. The ice pressure broke the whole upstream structure overnight." He paused. When it went, it sent a wall of backed-up water down the channel at once. That's what hit the lower road. The kitchen went quiet enough to hear the stove. "How bad?" Ronan asked. "The Fielding barn is partially down. The Burke root cellar is flooded. 2 sections of the lower creek road are gone. It'll need complete rebuilding in spring." Cully looked at his hands. "But nobody's hurt. Everybody got out." "Because someone warned them in time," Clara Henderson said from the far corner, where she'd been listening while she helped organize blankets. Cully nodded. He glanced at Maribel. Maribel was already at the stove and said nothing. "There's one more thing," Cully said. He hesitated the way he hesitated when he wasn't sure if the information was his to deliver. Ronan said, "Say it." "Crowell's office, in town." Cully paused. "He left. Some of the men he had in town say he packed up his files 2 days ago. Started moving things out before the storm even hit." He looked at Ronan. He knew the gate was failing. He knew what it was going to do. The kitchen's very quiet. "He knew," Ronan said, "and he left. His riders were gone before the worst of the storm. Everyone in town saw it." Cully's voice had something in it that wasn't quite anger, more like the specific cold disgust of a man who has confirmed what he suspected about another man's character. He walked away and let the flooding happen. Maribel set down the ladle she was holding. She stood for a moment with her back to the room. The flooding that damaged the Fielding barn and the Burke root cellar and the lower creek road. The flooding that had sent 31 people, including a 7-year-old boy who was still sitting near the stove with his color only just coming back, to find shelter in a mansion that could have easily been unprepared. All of it foreseeable. All of it the direct result of a diversion gate that should never have been built where it was, doing what it was always going to do when the ice pressure got sufficient. And Crowell had known, and left. She turned around. "He left," she said, to nobody and everybody. "But his documents didn't." Ronan looked at her. "The cessation order," she said. "Judge Fry froze the filing of new documents, but not the existing ones already in the county record. Crowell's office may be empty, but the Territorial Land Office still has every altered survey, every falsified water claim, every boundary adjustment going back 4 years. She looked at Ronan directly. He thought leaving before the hearing meant he escaped the consequences. He doesn't understand that the consequences are already on paper. Ronan's face did the thing that meant he was thinking fast. "The survey markers," he said. "The physical markers. If he left, his men left too," Cully confirmed. "All of them gone." "Then the markers he moved are still wherever he moved them," Maribel said. "Which means we can find them, compare them to the original filings. Physical evidence in addition to the document record." She paused. "This isn't over because he ran. It's actually easier now that he ran, because he can't interfere with the physical survey while we document it. Ronan stood up from the table. He was still tired, she could see it in the set of his shoulders. But the tiredness had a direction now, which was better than tiredness without one. After the storm breaks, he said. After the storm breaks, Maribel agreed. 2 days, maybe 3. And then we go back out to the Crowell sections and we document every marker. And then we send everything to Judge Fry. The document record, the physical survey comparison, and the testimony from the families about the flooding. She looked at him. He sabotaged a water structure that damaged 3 families' properties and then fled. That's not just a land dispute anymore. Ronan said, "No, it's not." They looked at each other across the kitchen table with 31 people moving around them and 4 dogs and the sound of the storm outside, and something that had been building between them since a night in November when she'd spread documents across his grandfather's table settled into a different shape. Not said, not named, but present. Cully cleared his throat quietly and found a reason to be in another room. The storm broke on the second day. It didn't so much end as exhaust itself. The wind dropped through the afternoon, and by evening the sky had the particular emptied clarity that follows a major storm, too blue, too still. The world pressed flat and white in every direction. The families began leaving the following morning. It was not quick. The road needed assessment. The water had receded from the lower sections but left mud and debris, and several families needed help loading what they'd brought. The Vale Ranch hands worked alongside the Homestead men without distinction, which was not something that would have happened 8 months ago, and which everyone noticed and nobody made a speech about. The Henderson family was the last to go. Abel Henderson shook Ronan's hand in the front doorway with the firmness of a man making a statement rather than a greeting. Then he turned to Maribel. He didn't say anything for a moment. He was a man who felt things deeply and had not spent his life finding words for them. Finally he said, "My boy, the little one, he was cold bad when we got here." "I know," Maribel said. "You knew what to do." "I've seen it before." He nodded. His jaw worked. "Well," he said, "thank you for that." She nodded back. After they were gone, the mansion was quiet in a way it hadn't been for 3 days. Not the old emptiness, a different quiet, the kind that comes after a room has been full and warm and has kept that warmth in its walls even after the people leave. Maribel stood in the front room for a moment, looking at the fireplace. Someone had left a child's mitten on the hearth. She picked it up and put it on the mantel in case anyone came back for it. She heard Ronan behind her. "The East Barn section needs proper repair before the next cold spell," she said, without turning. "I've already talked to Cully about it," he said. She turned. He was leaning against the doorframe in the way he had when something was on his mind that he hadn't fully organized into words yet. "3 months ago," he said, "I went to town looking for someone to cook a supper." "I know," she said. "I was not thinking clearly about what this house needed." "Most people aren't clear about what they need," Maribel said. "That's not a criticism." "No," he agreed. "It's just true." He looked at the mantel, at the child's mitten sitting there. "What are you thinking about?" "For spring." The question was carefully weighted. Not "what are you planning" or "what are your intentions," or any of the several versions of "are you leaving" that she'd heard from men before, asked with the particular proprietorial quality she'd always found suffocating. This was a genuine question about what she was thinking. The distinction mattered to her more than she could easily explain. "I want to walk the Crowell sections," she said, "before the snow melts and the markers shift. I want to document everything physically while we can still see where the disturbance is." She paused. "And I want to write up the full case for Judge Fry. The flooding, the physical evidence, the document record, all of it in one complete account. Properly organized so it holds up to every challenge Crowell's lawyers are going to throw at it." "That'll take weeks," Ronan said. "Probably." He nodded. The room was quiet. "And after that?" he said. She looked at him. He held the look with the particular stillness he'd always had. Not pushing, not retreating, just present in the full attention way that she had tried not to find as significant as she kept finding it. "I don't know yet," she said. It was honest. He nodded again. "All right," he said. Not disappointed, accepting, the way he accepted most things that couldn't be controlled. He pushed off the doorframe and started toward the back of the house. Then he stopped. "The water cooperative," he said. Henderson's water rights, the Fieldings, the Burkes, the three families who lost claims before we started. When this is settled, legally settled, I want to establish a formal water access agreement, legally binding, not charity, a cooperative structure with equal standing for every party. He looked back at her. Something that can't be undone by the next man with a leather satchel and a compliant clerk. Maribel looked at him. That's a significant thing to establish, she said. I know what it is, he said. I've been thinking about it since the night you told me about Crowell, about how the only reason we have solid water rights is because my grandfather was more suspicious and more thorough than the man trying to steal from him. His jaw tightened slightly. That shouldn't be the only reason a family gets to keep what they built. That's not... He stopped, started again. That's not what I want this ranch to mean. She held very still. I'll need someone with legal knowledge to structure it properly, he said, and someone who understands water rights documentation well enough to make it bulletproof. I know what documentation looks like, she said carefully. I know you do, he said, and then quietly, I'm not asking you to do my work, Maribel. I'm asking you to help me do something that matters, because you understand it better than I do. She looked at him for a long moment. At the man who had gone out into a blizzard with her at 6 a.m, who had sat across a document table at midnight and listened, who had ridden to the county seat after armed riders blocked his road and said you heard her when she'd answered for both of them, who had fed 31 people in a storm and not once in the whole 3 days said anything about how much it was costing him. I'll help you build it, she said. He nodded. And something in his face settled, not relief exactly, because he was not a man who let relief show easily, but the slightly less tightness that served the same purpose. He went to find Cully about the barn repair. Maribel stood in the front room for another moment. On the mantel, the child's mitten sat exactly where she'd put it. She went to the document room. She needed to start organizing everything for Judge Fry, and she needed to think clearly, and the document room was where she thought most clearly these days, surrounded by the careful accumulated records of a family that had believed, against the evidence of their era, that what you wrote down and witnessed and properly filed could outlast the people who tried to undo it. She pulled the surviving copies of everything they'd sent to the judge and began laying it out again from the beginning. The original survey discrepancies, the boundary manipulations, the water diversion records, the witness statements from P.D. Graves and the 2 other land office workers, the physical flooding damage from the gate failure. She worked for 3 hours without stopping. Then she found something she had not looked at closely before. It was a survey note in the back of the oldest file she'd pulled, her own grandfather's era records from Ronan's document room, a survey note from 1864 attached to a boundary filing for the original creek claim. She'd glossed over it before because it predated the Crowell scheme by more than a decade and seemed unrelated. She read it again now, more carefully. Then she sat back. The 1864 survey note described the original placement of a boundary marker on the northeast section of what was now the Fielding claim. It was specific, bearing, distance, reference to a particular rock outcropping, the kind of specificity that surveyors used when they expected the marker to be challenged. She pulled Crowell's altered survey for the same section. The marker he had relocated, the one that had shifted the Fielding's creek access 40 feet to put it on his land, was described in terms that deliberately avoided referencing the 1864 rock outcropping. Because if you referenced the rock outcropping, you couldn't make the relocation work. The outcropping was fixed. It was still there. And any surveyor who checked the 1864 filing against the current marker and the rock outcropping would immediately see the discrepancy. Crowell had known this. The careful omission was not an accident. It was specific, deliberate, legally meaningful evidence of intent. Maribel set the 2 documents side by side and looked at them for a long time. This was not just negligence or aggressive interpretation. This was knowing falsification. The difference between those 2 things in territorial law was substantial. She was still sitting there, very still, when Ronan appeared in the doorway. He looked at her face and said, "What did you find?" She looked up. "I found the piece that changes the whole shape of it," she said. "Come and look." He crossed the room and bent over the table beside her, and she walked him through it. The 1864 note, the Crowell survey, the deliberate omission of the rock outcropping reference that would have made the falsification immediately visible. She kept her voice level and precise. The way she kept her voice when the thing she was describing was significant and she needed him to follow the logic rather than respond to the feeling of it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He knew exactly what he was doing, Ronan said. From the beginning, Maribel said. This wasn't opportunistic. He researched the original filings carefully enough to know which references to remove to make the falsification survivable under normal examination. He was counting on no one having the 1864 records. She paused. He didn't know about your grandfather's copies. Ronan looked at the documents. His grandfather's careful, slightly old-fashioned handwriting on the 1864 note, and Crowell's lawyer's precise modern hand on the altered survey, and the gap between them that was exactly the shape of a deliberate crime. We were the only people who could catch this, he said. Yes, Maribel said. He straightened up. He said very quietly, your family, the Nebraska farm. Did the man who took it, did he use the same method? She had not talked about Nebraska since the night in his office when she'd first brought him the Crowell evidence, and she had not mentioned the specific method her father's adversary had used. She looked at the documents. Similar, she said. My father's creek access. Same idea. Relocate a marker that moves the water access off his property. I didn't have records old enough to catch the discrepancy. She paused. I was 22. I didn't know what I was looking for. By the time I understood it, the legal proceedings were over, and we'd lost. The room was quiet. You've been carrying that for 9 years, Ronan said. I've been learning from it for 9 years, she said. The distinction was important to her. It was how she had survived, not by carrying it as weight, but by converting it into knowledge. This is what that learning was for. He looked at her for a long time. She met the look steadily because that was who she was. A woman who had taught herself to meet things steadily, even when they cost her something. Maribel, he said. I know, she said quietly, because she did know. She knew what was in his face, and she knew what it meant, and she knew that she had been knowing it for longer than she'd admitted to herself. She was not ready to say it. She might not be ready to say it for a while. That was true, and she didn't pretend otherwise. But she looked at the 1864 survey note, at the clean handwriting of a man who had been suspicious and thorough and right, and she thought about how the right document, kept carefully, in the right hands, at the right moment, could undo what had seemed permanent and irreversible. How some things could be taken back. How some losses, if you understood them fully and held on long enough, could become something else. She picked up her pen and went back to the case document. She had a lot left to write. She finished the case document on a Tuesday. It took 11 more days after finding the 1864 survey note, 11 days of writing and cross-referencing and rewriting, of checking legal citations against the territorial codebooks Ronan had sent Cully to borrow from the county seat library, of reading her own arguments back to herself at night in the East Wing room, and looking for the places where a hostile lawyer could find a gap and closing them before they could be found. She was not a lawyer. She had never pretended to be one. But she had spent 9 years watching what happened when documentation was incomplete and arguments were made from passion rather than evidence. And she had learned from that watching the way she learned from everything, by converting observation into something she could use. The document was 41 pages. It covered the original survey discrepancies, the altered boundary markers, the systematic water diversion, the 1864 reference note, and its deliberate omission from Crowell's filings, the flood damage caused by the failed diversion gate, the witness statements from Petey Graves and 2 other land office employees, and a final section that laid out, in plain consecutive logic, the evidence of knowing and intentional falsification going back to the earliest altered filing. She read it through one final time on Tuesday evening, sitting at the document room table with the lamp turned up, and the rest of the house quiet around her. Then she set it down and sat with her hands flat on the table and thought about her father. He had been a quiet man, patient in the way that farmers are patient, not passive, but genuinely oriented toward the long term, toward the season rather than the day. He had believed, with the particular faith of a man who had never been seriously deceived, that if you worked honestly and recorded your work honestly and treated people honestly, that the world would eventually reflect that back to you. He had been wrong about the world. He had not been wrong about the working. Maribel was not her father. She had the same patience and had lost the same faith in the world's reflexive fairness, and had replaced it with something more durable, The understanding that fairness didn't happen on its own. It had to be built. Document by document, record by record, conversation by conversation, in the years before the crisis came, so that when the crisis came, there was something solid to stand on. She closed the document. She went to find Ronan. He was in the front room, not at his desk, sitting in the chair nearest the fire with a glass of whiskey and the look of a man who had been thinking rather than reading, the book in his lap open to the same page it had been on for the past hour. He looked up when she came in. She set the document on the table beside his chair. "It's done," she said. He looked at it. At the thickness of it, the careful binding she'd put on it, the label she'd written on the front in her clear handwriting. In the matter of Crowell Land and Water Associates, complete evidentiary record, prepared for the Honorable Aldous Fry, territorial judge. 41 pages, she said, every piece of evidence organized sequentially. The 1864 note is in Section 4 with a full legal annotation explaining its significance. P.D. Graves's statement is corroborated by 2 other sources in Section 6. She paused. It's complete. Nothing missing. He picked it up, held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it. "When do we take it?" he asked. "As soon as the road to the county seat is reliably passable," she said. "Another week, maybe less?" He nodded. He set the document carefully on the table and looked at the fire for a moment. "Sit down," he said. She sat in the chair across from him, which was not something she did often. Sat in the front room with him in the evening. She was usually in the kitchen or the document room until late, and he was usually here or at his desk, and they moved through the same house in the way of 2 people who were comfortable sharing space without needing to occupy it simultaneously. "I want to talk to you about the cooperative," he said. "Now?" "While I'm thinking clearly and before I lose my nerve," he said, with the flat honesty he sometimes produced when she least expected it. She waited. "I've been working on the structure with the land records as a base," he said. "Equal water access rights for 6 families. The Hendersons, Fieldings, Burkes, and the 3 families whose claims were altered before we started. Legally binding, administered by a board with rotating members from each family." He paused. "And 1 permanent administrative steward." She looked at him. The steward would be responsible for maintaining the documentation, making sure the records stay current, that transfers are properly filed, that no future Crowell can walk in and start quietly moving markers. He held her look. "I want that person to be you, not as an employee of the ranch, as a legal officer of the cooperative, with your name on the founding documents and your authority over the record-keeping independent of anything to do with me or this ranch." Maribel was quiet for a moment. "That's a significant offer," she said carefully. "I know what it is," he said. "I've been thinking about it since November, since the night in the document room when you found the 1864 note, and I watched you understand what it meant before I'd finished reading it." He put down the whiskey glass. "Maribel, I've worked this ranch for 17 years. I've hired good men and managed well and made decisions that held up. But I have never in my life watched someone do what you've done here. In 8 months. Starting from nothing, with 1 set of canvas bags and a crate of preserving jars." She didn't say anything. "I hired you for 1 night," he said. "And you didn't just cook a supper. You saw what the house needed and you built it. You saw what the valley needed and you fought for it. You looked at a legal scheme that destroyed your own family, and instead of letting it destroy you, you spent 9 years learning how to take it apart." He stopped. His jaw tightened slightly. "I don't know how to say this cleanly. I've been trying for 3 months to find the clean version, and I don't think there is one." "Say it the real way," Maribel said. He looked at her directly. "I don't want you to leave," he said. "Not because this ranch needs you, though it does. Not because the cooperative needs you, though it does. Because I—" He stopped again. The word he was reaching for was one he hadn't used in a long time and was not fluent in. "Because the thought of you leaving and me going back to what this was before you got here is something I can't make myself accept anymore." The fire snapped in the silence. Maribel looked at him, at the man who had gone out into a blizzard at her word, who had opened his grandfather's documents without hesitation, who had sat across a legal table from riders blocking a public road and said you heard her when she answered for both of them. The man who was not comfortable with softness and was offering it anyway, clumsily, in the real way rather than the clean way, because she'd asked for the real version. She said, I need you to understand something before I say anything back. Tell me, he said. I am not easy, she said. I know that. I am stubborn and I run on my own logic, and there have been 3 occasions in the past 8 months where I've said things to you or to your men that were sharper than they needed to be, and I apologized for 2 of them, and I still think the 3rd one was justified. She looked at him steadily. I am built the way I'm built, and I will never be a woman who disappears into someone else's life. I've watched women do that. I watched my mother do it, and she was a good woman, and it still made her smaller. I know, he said. You say that now. I've known it since the first week, he said, when you reorganized the pantry and told me exactly why and were right and didn't apologize for being right. Something crossed his face that was close to amusement and something else simultaneously. Maribel, if I wanted a woman who would disappear quietly into this house, I had 8 months to find one. I didn't look. She held the look for a long moment. The cooperative stewardship, she said, with my name on the founding documents. Legally independent, he said, not tied to your position here. If you and I... He paused. Whatever happens between us, the stewardship is yours. It doesn't go away. That was the thing. That was the specific, precise thing that no one had ever offered her before. Not something contingent, not something that required her to maintain a particular relationship to maintain her standing. Something that was simply hers. She exhaled slowly. I'll stay, she said. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Ronan said, after the legal proceedings, when the case is settled. He was choosing his words with the care of a man who understood that the next ones mattered. I'd like to ask you something more than staying. Ask me then, she said, when the time comes. You'll say yes, he said, with the flat confidence that was both his most irritating and most accurate quality. Maybe, she said. Ask me and find out. The corner of his mouth moved. They rode to the county seat 10 days later, on a morning in early March when the road was passable and the sky was the clean, washed-out blue that Montana produced after hard winters as a kind of apology. Cully drove. Maribel had the 41-page document in the oilcloth inside her coat again, against her body, because some habits were worth keeping. No one blocked the road this time. Judge Fry received them in his office and read the complete document that afternoon while they waited in the anteroom, which took 2 hours and a pot of coffee that his clerk replenished twice. When he came out, he had the expression of a man who had read something that confirmed what he'd suspected, while also showing him several things he hadn't known. He said, Miss Shaw, the 1864 survey note. Where did you locate this? The Vale Ranch Document Archive, Maribel said. Ronan's grandfather kept certified copies of all territorial survey filings through 1870. The specific note was attached to the original creek claim filing for the Northeast section, and you identified its relevance to the Crowell alterations. The omission was specific, Maribel said. Crowell's surveys for the same section avoided any reference to the rock outcropping that appears in the 1864 note, because the outcropping would have immediately anchored the original marker placement. Without the reference, the displacement looked like a clerical variation. With it, it's clearly deliberate falsification. Judge Fry looked at her for a moment with the expression he'd had at their first meeting, the careful, assessing look of a man recalibrating something. You should have been a lawyer, he said. I was busy with other things, Maribel said. He almost smiled. He went back into his chambers and came out 20 minutes later with a document of his own, a formal judicial finding of fraudulent land and water document manipulation, covering all 6 affected claims, with an order for full restoration of original boundary and water access rights and a referral to the Territorial Attorney General for criminal investigation of Silas Crowell's activities. It was not the end. Criminal proceedings took time, and Crowell's lawyers were already filing challenges from whatever city Crowell had retreated to, and the road between a judicial finding and actual consequences was, in 1878 Montana Territory, considerably longer and rougher than justice ought to require. But the foundation was laid, and foundations built correctly do not need to be rebuilt. Ronan signed the water cooperative documents the same afternoon in Judge Fry's office, with Fry as witness. Maribel's name appeared on the founding charter as administrative steward, her authority over the cooperative's records, defined in 3 specific paragraphs that she had written herself, and which would, she was confident, outlast any attempt to undo them. She held the signed copy of the charter for a moment before folding it into her coat. Her name, on a legal document, not as a dependent, not as a witness, not as a signatory to someone else's agreement, as an officer of a thing she had helped create. She thought about her father again, about the farm in Nebraska that was someone else's land now, with someone else's marker on the creek boundary. She thought about how he would have understood this moment, not perfectly, because he had been a simpler man than the situation required, but he would have recognized the thing at the center of it, that the only real answer to people who used documentation to take what wasn't theirs was better documentation held by people who understood what it was for. She folded the charter and put it in her coat and walked out of Judge Fry's office into the March afternoon, where Cully was waiting with the wagon and the draft horses standing patient and steaming in the cold. The drive home was quieter than the drive out. Cully seemed to understand that the quiet was a good kind and didn't disturb it. The road ran along the creek for several miles, and the creek was running properly, full and clear and moving at the pace it was supposed to move. The ice broken up and gone, the water finding its original channel without the upstream interference that had been redirecting it for years. Maribel watched it through the side of the wagon. Water, she had learned, always remembered where it was supposed to go. You could redirect it, dam it, divert it, alter the documents that described it, move the markers that defined its boundaries on paper. But the water itself kept its own record. The original channel was still there under the altered ground. The moment the interference was removed, the water went back. She thought that was probably true of people too, that the original self, the one before the losses, before the years of moving and not staying, before the careful habits of not attaching built up like scar tissue over everything soft, was still there somewhere, still running in its original direction, waiting for the interference to be removed. She was 31 years old. She had been running west for 9 years. She was done running. Spring came to Red Willow the way spring came after hard winters, suddenly, almost aggressively, as if making up for lost time. The snow pulled back from the south-facing slopes first, then the lower meadows, then the creek banks, revealing the mud and debris of the flooding and also the first green things, which came up through the damage with the indifference that growing things had always had toward human difficulty. The Vale Ranch hands repaired the east barn section properly. The Fielding family rebuilt their barn wall with help from the Henderson men, who came with tools and 2 days of labor without being asked. The Burke root cellar was cleaned and restocked. The Lower Creek Road was rebuilt in sections by a combination of valley families working together in a way that would not have happened a year ago, before anyone knew that cooperation was possible, before anyone had seen what a shared crisis survived together did to the distance between neighbors. Maribel started the kitchen garden in April. She had been thinking about it all winter, the layout, the soil amendments needed, the particular logic of companion planting that maximized yield in the short Montana growing season. She had it planned in her head the way she had recipes planned, the kind of knowing that didn't need to be written because it was already organized in a deeper part of her mind. She was on her knees in the south-facing bed near the kitchen door, her hands in the cold soil, when Ronan came and stood behind her. She had heard him coming. She kept working. He said, "The Crowell appeal was denied." She stopped, turned to look at him. "Fry's office sent a rider this morning," he said. "The Territorial Attorney General has accepted the criminal referral. Crowell's lawyers can challenge the civil findings indefinitely, but the criminal investigation is proceeding independently." He paused. Petey Graves gave his full formal statement last week. The 2 other land office workers have cooperated. The Attorney General's investigator found 3 more altered filings we hadn't found ourselves. Maribel sat back on her heels. "It's done," she said. Not a question, not quite a statement, something between them. "It's done," Ronan said. She looked at her hands, soil dark, cold, solid on the ground that was solid under them. The kitchen garden that would be here in 3 months, 4 months, next year, and the year after. The things you planted when you intended to stay. She got up. She was not graceful about it. Her knees were cold and the ground was soft, and she went sideways slightly before she caught herself, and she did not pretend otherwise because there was no one in her life now that she pretended for. Ronan put his hand out. She took it to steady herself, And then she was standing, and they were standing together in the kitchen garden in the April cold, with the creek running properly behind the tree line and the mansion at her back with smoke coming from two of its chimneys. He didn't let go of her hand. She didn't pull it back. "You said to ask you when the time came," he said. "I did," she said. He looked at her in the way she had stopped trying to look away from, the direct, full attention way that had always been the thing about him she found most difficult to dismiss. "I'm asking," he said. She thought about the woman who had arrived in Red Willow on a grain merchant's wagon with 2 canvas bags and a crate of preserving jars she refused to put in the back. The woman who had looked at a broken-down house full of expensive empty rooms and seen immediately what it needed. Who had found, in a valley she'd never seen before, the same scheme that had taken everything from her family, and instead of passing through, instead of packing her bags and pointing herself further west, had stayed and fought. She thought about what it cost to stay. Not the work. The work was easy, relative to the other thing. The other thing was the opening of yourself to a place and its people, and the admission that you were not just passing through, that this was the place you were going to lose if it went wrong. She had not been willing to lose anything else. She had changed her mind. "Yes," she said. Ronan exhaled, a short, quiet sound that was not quite the release of held breath, but was close enough that she understood it. He brought her hand up and held it for a moment in both of his, looking at it the way people look at things they have been careful about and intend to keep being careful about. "I'm not easy either," he said. "I want you to know I know that." "I know you know it," she said. "You've been difficult in at least 11 specific ways since October." 11, he said. "I kept count," she said. "It seemed prudent." The corner of his mouth moved into the thing that was not quite a smile and was better than a smile. The genuine, slightly reluctant expression that appeared when something surprised him into being more himself than usual. "Maribel Shaw," he said. "Ronan Vale," she said back. They were married in June, under the cottonwoods along the restored creek, on a morning when the water was high and clear and the valley was so green it seemed excessive. The ceremony was short because they were both people who said what they meant without decoration and did not see the point in performing at length what could be stated plainly. Hector Bowes, the rancher who had told Ronan he was a fool for letting her go after the first supper, stood at the edge of the gathering with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man whose judgment had been vindicated in a way he found personally satisfying. Abel Henderson cried, which he had not expected to do, and his wife Clara handed him a handkerchief without comment, which was the gesture of a woman who had expected it. Cully grinned for the entire morning. Dort, the ranch cook, made the wedding supper. He had insisted, had started planning it in April, and had appeared in Maribel's kitchen 3 times to consult with her on specific points, which was the most extended conversation they'd had since the bean soup, and which pleased her more than she showed. The supper was good, not perfect. The biscuits were slightly overdone on the bottom in a way that Maribel noticed and Dort noticed and nobody else did, but it was real and generous and made with attention, which was better than perfect. At the end of the evening, when the families had gone and the ranch hands had drifted back to the bunkhouse and the mansion was quiet. With the warm after-people quiet she had come to love, Maribel stood in the kitchen and looked at it. The pots on their hooks, the stove that she had rebuilt from barely adequate to genuinely reliable, the shelves organized by use and weight and accessibility, the herbs drying in a bunch near the larder door, new ones she'd collected this spring, the same way someone had collected them years before her and left them for whoever came after. Ronan came and stood in the doorway. He looked at her and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment, because sometimes there was nothing to say that the room wasn't already saying. Then he said, "What are you thinking about?" She thought about it honestly. "The woman who dried those herbs," she said, nodding toward the bunch near the larder door. "Before me. I don't know who she was. One of the previous housekeepers, probably. But she dried yarrow and chamomile and hung them there, and when I arrived and found them, they were still good, still useful." She paused. "She didn't know I was coming, but she prepared as if someone was." Ronan looked at the herbs. "I never noticed them," he said. "I know," she said. "But they were there." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's what you've been doing, the whole time. Preparing as if someone was coming." "Preparing as if something was worth preparing for," she said. There's a difference. He moved into the kitchen properly and leaned against the counter in the way he had that she had filed without intending to file. The particular angle and the arms crossed loosely posture that meant he was comfortable and not trying to manage anything. "Tell me something," he said. "When you first came here, when you saw the house, what did you actually think?" She considered lying, which she decided against in about half a second. "I thought it was a house built by a man who understood the value of things and had never been taught the value of people," she said. "And I thought that was a fixable problem." He looked at her. "And was it?" he said. She looked at him, at the man standing in his kitchen in his own house in June, with the creek running properly outside and the valley held legally, and the doors of this mansion having been open to 31 people and 4 dogs in the middle of a blizzard, and still standing, still solid, still warm. "Getting there," she said. He laughed. It was not a polished sound. It was the laugh of a man who had not laughed easily in a long time and was still slightly surprised by the ease of it, which made it better. She turned back to putting the last of the supper things away, and he stayed in the doorway and let her, and the house settled around them both with the sound of a structure that had found, finally, what it was supposed to be. In the years that followed, the Vale Ranch prospered. The cattle operation expanded in the years of good rainfall and survived the lean years with the margin that Maribel had always insisted on building. The water cooperative held through challenges, through political pressure from interests that found community land agreements inconvenient, through the ordinary attrition of time and changing membership. Because the documentation was airtight and the records were maintained with the care of someone who understood exactly what happened when they weren't. Silas Crowell was tried in the territorial court in 1880. He was convicted of fraudulent document alteration and ordered to make financial restitution to the 6 affected families. He did not go to prison. The law in 1878 Montana Territory was not built to make that easy. But he was barred from operating in the territory, and his name became, in Red Willow, a useful shorthand for a particular kind of person. The families whose claims had been restored rebuilt. Not without difficulty. The Burkes had a hard year in 1881, the Fieldings lost cattle in the winter of 1882, but they rebuilt. And when they struggled, there was now a structure in the valley that recognized struggle as a community problem rather than a personal failure. Petey Graves left the land office in 1879 and became a notary public, which turned out to suit him considerably better. He was conscientious and thorough, and having lived through the experience of being pressured into doing something wrong, was extremely difficult to pressure after that. Maribel became what she had said she would become, and more. She became the person that frontier families came to when they had land documents they didn't understand, when they received legal notices they couldn't parse, when someone told them their water access had been quietly reclassified and they didn't know what to do. She was not a lawyer and she did not pretend to be, but she knew what questions to ask and where to look and how to read the gap between what a document said and what someone wanted it to mean. She taught younger women food preservation and livestock care and medical preparation, the practical knowledge that the frontier extracted from women without acknowledgement and that Maribel had decided should be acknowledged and passed on deliberately rather than lost between generations. She organized the first Red Willow Women's Preparation Circle in 1880, which was not a social club, though it served some social functions, but a practical organization that made sure no family in the valley faced winter without emergency stores, and that no woman had to do the kind of improvisation under pressure that Maribel had done during the blizzard without at least knowing how. Ronan gave the circle use of the smokehouse for meetings. He did not attend the meetings. He did not offer advice about how they should be run. He fixed the smokehouse roof in the fall of 1880 without being asked, which Maribel considered an accurate expression of his understanding of what was needed. They were not a perfect marriage. They argued about resources, about ranch decisions, about the 2 or 3 occasions when Ronan's tendency to handle things alone resurfaced with enough force that Maribel had to remind him with considerable directness that they had already covered this ground, and she had not been wrong about it then. He was sometimes too closed and she was sometimes too blunt, and they were both occasionally too stubborn to move first. And those weeks were difficult in the specific way that difficulty is difficult between 2 people who respect each other enough to hold their position. But they moved through it, because they were both people who believed in the work of a thing more than the comfort of it, and who had each, separately and for their own reasons, stopped expecting life to be comfortable and started expecting it to be real. There was a morning in the summer of 1883 when Maribel was in the kitchen garden, larger now, better established, in its third serious year, and Ronan came out with 2 cups of coffee and sat on the step and handed her one without saying anything, and she took it and sat down beside him, and they sat in the early morning looking at the valley that had been, over 5 years, made into something different by the slow, patient work of people who had decided it was worth making into something different. The creek ran in its original channel below the cottonwoods. The mansion behind them had smoke from the kitchen chimney and the sound of Dort starting breakfast and the distant voices of the ranch hands at the barn. The valley below, visible from the rise where the kitchen garden sat, showed 3 farmsteads where 2 years ago there had been one. The Burkes had rebuilt to the east, the Fieldings had expanded to the south, and the square of the Water Cooperative's survey markers, properly placed and properly recorded, visible as a shape in the landscape. "I want to tell you something," Ronan said. She waited. "When I posted that notice, one night, $4, I was thinking about the supper. I needed someone who could make the house look like a place a serious man lived." He held the coffee cup in both hands and looked at the valley. "I was not thinking about what it meant that I needed that, what it said about how I'd been living." "I know," Maribel said. "But you knew when you walked in," he said. "I could see it," she said. "The empty rooms, the furniture against the walls. A man can have everything and still be living like he's waiting for something that's already arrived." He was quiet for a moment. "What did you see?" he said. "When you walked in, what was missing?" She thought about it honestly. "Not things," she said. "Belonging. The sense that someone was here on purpose, that the house was chosen and not just occupied." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "A house without belonging in it is just an expensive shelter. You had built an excellent shelter, but a shelter is what you build before you've decided to stay." He looked at her. "And now?" he said. She looked at the valley, at the creek running in its proper channel, at the cooperative survey markers, at the 3 farmsteads and the road between them that families traveled now without fear of finding it reclassified as someone else's property, at the kitchen garden behind them where something grew because she had decided it would grow. "Now," she said, "it's a home." The coffee was good. The morning was cold the way Montana mornings were cold even in summer, brisk and clean, the kind of cold that made you aware of the warmth of what you were holding. Ronan put his arm around her shoulders. She leaned into it without ceremony, without performance, with the ease of a woman who had spent a long time not leaning on anything and had decided that the right kind of leaning was not weakness. It was just the choice to stop carrying everything alone, which was something she had once said to him in a different context, and which she had eventually learned to apply to herself. The valley held the morning light. The creek ran. And in Red Willow, in the years that followed, people still told the story, the way stories like this move through small communities, changing slightly with each telling, but keeping the true shape of themselves. They told it to daughters who didn't yet know how hard the world could be, and to sons who didn't yet understand what strength actually looked like. They told it in different ways depending on who was telling it, but the center of it was always the same. That once, a wealthy man with everything had lived in an empty house, and a woman had arrived with 2 canvas bags and a crate of preserving jars and had looked at everything he'd built, the walls, the fences, the empire of carefully managed acres, and had seen clearly what was missing. Not because she was remarkable in the way of stories that make their characters into something more than human, but because she was the kind of person who had been taught by loss to look carefully at what was still there, and by loneliness to understand what made a place worth staying in, and by years of moving to recognize, when she finally found it, the place where moving stopped. She had not saved him. He had not saved her. They had, separately and then together, saved the thing that made both of them possible: the ground under their feet, the water in the creek, the document record that said, "This is yours, and it is witnessed, and it will hold." And from that ground, they had built something that outlasted them, which is all anyone, in the end, can really hope to do with the time they are given and the ground they are given to stand on.